What's up? This is Nate from Spirit Adrift. I'm here with Revolver, and we are talking about the 11 greatest metal bands of the 90s. My list here is in alphabetical order, so I'll just start at the top. Number 1 is Acid Bath from Louisiana. They're a very singular band. There's nobody that sounds like them. It's nasty stuff, man. They're so swamped out that if you say they're from New Orleans, they get offended because they're from an even swampier part of Louisiana. Their sound is really unique. It's kind of a combination of Dax Riggs, like psychedelic, crazy Clive Barker stuff, a lot of melody and just trippy lyrics and trippy vocals. And then you have Sammy's like first wave death metal, first wave black metal influence, and then the kind of the archetypal sludgy Louisiana / New Orleans sound. It's all in there. Very unique band, only put out 2 records, and then they split up. Dax did Agents of Oblivion, who I almost put on this list, but today it's Acid Bath. Number 2, once again, alphabetical order, Alice in Chains. Everybody knew they would be on this list. Dirt is a perfect record. I can say that about very few records. Even a lot of my favorite records, I wouldn't say they're perfect. There's a couple skippers or maybe a couple songs that aren't as good as the others. Dirt's a perfect record. And if you watch footage of Alice in Chains from that year, it's undeniable that they were the best band in the world for a certain time period in the 90s. Number 3, Danzig. You knew he would be on here. First 2 Danzig records, first 3 really, but especially the second one is one of my favorite albums. That original lineup of Danzig's band with Chuck Biscuits, John Christ, Eerie Von, to me that's one of the best rock band lineups ever. You know, they had like Chuck Biscuits is like the punk rock John Bonham, so they had that real just primal like fierce power on the drums. Danzig's songwriting on those first 3 albums is incredible. Vocals, obviously, everything. It was a whole package, man. Had Rick Rubin producing. Doesn't get better. So Danzig is definitely on my list. Number 4, gotta go with Death, man. The monstrosity, free for life, they'll always be, never know. Chuck Schuldiner. I've heard it said Chuck Schuldiner. I'm not really sure what it is, but Chuck is one of my biggest inspirations for sure. I feel like Death in the 90s took a lot more creative risks than any other, you know, first wave American death metal bands. Chuck sort of like invented it in my book and then perfected it and then continued to reinvent it with subsequent albums throughout the 90s. You know, Spiritual Healing was the first one I heard and I love everything about it. That was my favorite for a long time. But then you listen to something like Symbolic and he's incorporating like the classic metal influences, the Iron Maiden influences. He's wearing kitty cat t-shirts and interviews and stuff like that. He was just a really groundbreaking, talented genius, man. Huge influence. Yeah, Death are the kings of 90s death metal, so they're on the list. All right, number 5 is a band that unfortunately wasn't all that active in the 90s, but they put out 2 records. One of them is one of the best metal albums ever made. Talking about Dissection from Sweden. And a bunch of unfortunate shit happened after they made Storm of the Light's Bane. And John Neutveit was kind of a piece of shit and went to prison. Yeah, it would have been a lot cooler if he hadn't done what he did and instead just kept making cool music, because Storm of the Light's Bane is amazing. It sets the bar for extreme metal for me. It's extreme, but it has songs, it has hooks, it has dynamics. It's super memorable and super powerful. So I gotta put Dissection on the list. I hope he doesn't come back from the dead and kick my ass. Number 6 on my list of greatest metal bands of the 90s, you have to mention Metallica, man. Hey, I'm your only true friend now. They changed the whole game with the Black Album. That record and the amount of work and the amount of production that went into it was sort of unprecedented for real metal bands at the time. You know, you had bands like Def Leppard, maybe even Priest and Maiden in the 80s that went crazy with the arrangements and production and pre-production and all of that. But the Black Album just took it to a whole other level. And the subsequent touring on the Black Album sort of took touring to a whole other level. You know, they're doing 3+ hour sets and taking breaks in between and switching instruments. And yeah, it was just excess in the coolest possible way. And Metallica in the 90s are pretty much undeniably like on top of the metal game, with the exception of maybe one other band that I'm gonna mention here shortly. Next on the list, here's another one that you all knew we were gonna talk about, Pantera. Kind of hard to talk about 90s metal and not mention Pantera. Every other band was going soft, you know, sort of pursuing creative choices that may or may not have been the wisest decisions and definitely were not the heaviest decisions. And Pantera did the opposite. And the phenomenon of that band is that they got heavier and less accessible and more extreme with each album. And the band just kept getting more popular. I think that's the last time that that's happened. They were special. We all know they were special. Pantera is definitely one of the best metal bands of the 90s. This is one I'm excited about. Solitude Aeturnus from Texas. Not a whole lot of people know about this band. I'm kind of ashamed to say I didn't know much about them until Spirit Adrift started getting compared to them, and then I really dove into their catalog. They're one of my favorite metal bands, period. They got the Candlemass vibe, they got the Trouble vibe, the Black Sabbath vibe, but they're from Texas, so they've got this grit that none of those bands really have. They have a Pantera kind of grit, even like ZZ Top. It's just got attitude, man. Heavy, unique, you know? They use the Phrygian mode a lot, which is it's a guitar scale that Death uses. It's like real Egyptian sounding. So they just have a lot of cool stuff going on. It creates this unique sound. They got the Texas thing, they got the traditional Doom thing, they got a little bit of redneck in them. They got this Egyptian Phrygian mode that they use in a lot of songs. And I just think they're one of the most overlooked metal bands, period. And definitely one of my favorite metal bands of the 90s. Next on the list is Trouble from Chicago. We're on tour with Crowbar right now, and Kirk and I pretty much just only talk about Trouble every day. Legendary band. Should have been a lot bigger than they ended up being. You know, they did a self-titled album with Rick Rubin in the 90s, and we're really getting some label support and that sort of stuff. Went on tour with Pantera, and sometimes things just don't work out, man. But Trouble is one of the best American bands, period, in any genre. They're one of the best metal bands. I remember reading an interview with one of the guys, and he said they wanted to be as heavy and as dark and doomy as Black Sabbath, but with the dual guitar attack of Judas Priest. And I think that's a perfect way of describing it. Crazy vocals, rest in peace Eric Wagner. Crazy guitars, crazy songs, just heavy, man. They were so good that Metallica went and saw them and stole all their amp settings. That's the tone on the first couple of Metallica records, is Trouble's amp settings. Here's another one we had to talk about when we're talking about the 90s, Type O Negative. One of my favorite bands, period. October Rust was a daily listen for me when I was growing up for years. World Coming Down now is one of my favorite albums ever made. You know, we just covered a Type O song from World Coming Down. I mean, what can I say about Type O that hasn't already been said? Totally unique, groundbreaking, beautiful, tragic, heavy, pissed off, everything I want out of music. So I left a wild card slot. I'm gonna talk about the Cranberries, man. Fuck it. Dolores O'Riordan's one of my biggest vocal influences. I loved her, man. I didn't even know her, and I feel this love for her and what she did, and I don't know if it's like my Irish genes or what. Their music resonated with me, and especially her vocals. And I was a fan for a while and didn't even realize that she was a primary songwriter, which is just astounding. There's so many good Cranberries songs. The first album is amazing. Listen to it on headphones. The guitar layers, the tones. The 90s was kind of the peak, like, big budget productions. Labels just throwing infinite amount of money at these bands, especially a band like the Cranberries who had the look and the vibe and just infinitely marketable, but also happen to be an incredible band with one of the most unique and soulful and haunting vocalists of all time. May not be everybody's definition of metal, but the Cranberries are on my list and fucking deal with it. All right, that's my list. That's the 11 greatest metal bands of the 90s. Talk some shit in the comments. Let us know what your favorites are. Let me know why I'm wrong or stupid, and thanks for watching.